Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Nature Live Online. I'm Christina. I'm going to be your host today. Now, if you've been watching us for the last few months, thank you so much for being there for us. And if you're new, thank you so much for joining. This is more community. And let me tell you a little bit more about Nature Live Online. Now, Nature Lives were shows that used to happen at the Natural History Museum in London with a live audience. But since the museum is closed, although not for long, we keep doing them. We kept doing them online so we can keep bringing the secrets of the museum, what goes on behind the scenes, to you. We invite scientists to share their passion and the work with you. And because they are live, you can ask questions during the show. I've got loads, but please send your questions through and I'll get through as many as possible during the next 45 minutes. Now, we have a really special guest today because we're going to be talking about a topic that is really close to my heart. When I was really little, my favorite dinosaur were the long-necked giants, the sauropods. And today we have the expert David Button to tell us more about them. Now, let me welcome David. Hi, David. Thank you so much for joining.
Christina, how are you?
Yeah, not bad. How are you doing?
Yeah, not so bad. But yeah, thanks for having me today as well.
I'm really excited to be talking about these really special animals, and I'm sure we're going to pass on this passion about sauropods that you have to our public. But before we start talking about these amazing dinosaurs, do you mind telling us what's your role at the Natural History Museum?
Yeah, of course. So I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Natural History Museum, and so that means that I work behind the scenes researching dinosaurs. So in particular, I'm currently looking at the early dinosaurs, and we're performing CT scans, so X-rays of the skulls, and using these to help work out how early dinosaurs fed and how this fueled the evolution of the group to take over the world during the age of dinosaurs. Before that, I've also done quite a lot of work on sauropods, which is why we're going to be talking about those today.
And I think you're quite fond of them as well. But have they always been your favorite dinosaurs, these big giant dinosaurs, the sauropods?
So potentially embarrassingly, they haven't always been my favorites. So when I was a kid, my favorites were the duck-billed dinosaurs, so things like Parasaurolophus. I also like the armed dinosaurs and the horned dinosaurs. So sauropods were never the bottom for me because I've always liked the plant-eating dinosaurs more than the meat-eating dinosaurs. Just because, plant-eating dinosaurs are generally more interesting. They don't overcompensate for how boring they are by just taking bites out of everything like T-Rex does. But I liked the duck-billed dinosaurs more because I thought they were more refined than the big sauropods. But the sauropods, as I got older and my taste matured, I realized that sauropods are actually definitely the most interesting dinosaurs. It's like, what's the first thing you think of as being remarkable about dinosaurs? It's that they're big, right? It's that they're huge. And that's like really interesting from a biological perspective because size is one of the most important parts of any animal's biology. And sauropods were the biggest dinosaurs, the biggest land animals that ever lived. And they were also the only group of dinosaurs that got significantly larger than any other land animals. So that really does make them the most interesting group.
We're going to be talking a little bit more about that, but I've got a cheeky question. Have you got a favorite dinosaur or a specimen that you really love, David?
So my favorite dinosaur these days, I think, is probably Camarasaurus. So it was a sauropod from the late Jurassic of North America. And I like this thing a lot because a lot of my PhD work was on it. So some of my first paleontological research was on Camarasaurus. And particularly, it was on the skull of this specimen here. So this is a specimen housed at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. And it's of a nearly complete young, so still quite young, but still nearly complete Camarasaurus, which I think is just a really nice specimen. You can see the whole thing laid out there. And I also feel kind of sorry for Camarasaurus because whenever you got your standard books of sauropods, it's usually there in the corner. There's always one about how, Diplodocus and Brachiosaurus were these big, beautiful, graceful animals. And then for some reason, they always think it's okay to say Camarasaurus was this ugly, sort of snub-nosed one, which isn't fair at all. Yeah, Camarasaurus is chunky and brutish, but that's how I like my dinosaurs. It's cool. So yeah, it's still beautiful to me. I think it's very nice. So I'd say it has to be my favorite.
Definitely not fair at all on Camarasaurus. I really like it too. But now we've seen a couple of pictures. We've seen your favorite one, Camarasaurus, there in the fossil, and we've seen a few pictures of sauropods. What is a sauropod? What makes a sauropod, David?
Yeah, so sauropods, they're generally big, bulky dinosaurs with the long necks and the long tails that ate plants. And sauropods belong to a larger group of dinosaurs called the sauropodomorphs, and that includes the sauropods and their ancestors, which we'll get to in a bit. And those are one of the three main groups of dinosaurs. So you have the theropods and the sauropodomorphs, and together those form the saurischians or the lizard-hipped dinosaurs. And then you have the other main group, the ornithischians, which includes the duckbills and the horned dinosaurs and the armored dinosaurs. And they form their group, the ornithischians or the bird-hipped dinosaurs. And so you can see that sauropods are like one of the three main sort of radiations of dinosaurs. Now, when sauropods were found, and some of them were found like in the early 20th century, people thought, oh, these are huge. They must have been aquatic. They must have been like these water-living dinosaurs. But it relatively quickly became apparent that that wasn't true at all. We have wealths of evidence that show that sauropods actually fully lived on land. So sauropods were these quite active, upright, land-living, giant, long-necked dinosaurs.
That's amazing. And again, what you said, giant long-necked dinosaur, but they display a huge diversity. There's many different ones. They're weird and wonderful. So let's go through all of them, David. Let's go through a few cool examples and find out more about them. But let's start from the beginning. What was the first sauropod, and roughly when did they appear first?
So the first sauropods appeared roughly around the start of the Jurassic period, so about sort of 200 million years ago-ish, and they then varied into loads of different shapes and sizes after that. But as for where sauropods came from, the first sauropodomorphs, so that's the larger group which sauropods belong, appeared about 230 million years ago in South America. And these include things like Bureolestes. And Bureolestes doesn't look a lot like the later sauropods. It was about the size of a dog, and it had these sharp recurved teeth that show that it ate at least part of its diet was meat. It seemed to eat quite a lot of meat. But then later on in the Triassic period, things like Bureolestes diversified into a group called the prosauropods, and those were epitomized by Plateosaurus, which is like this 9-meter long animal from Germany. And these things were bipedal, like these clawed hands, and they were the most important large herbivores of their day. So when Plateosaurus appeared, it was like the biggest animal on Earth, and these like ate tree leaves and all sorts of things. But as we went into the Jurassic and the sauropods proper appeared, so sauropods all being bulky and importantly being quadrupedal, so being on 4 legs, they replaced the prosauropods in this role and became like the main group of giant herbivores for the rest of the age of dinosaurs.
Exactly, and they changed a lot. They became huge, and I think one of the first questions that always comes through, and in fact we already had one question about this, is what is the biggest sauropod? Now I know that you're going to mention Argentinosaurus, but we have a question from Michael, who is 9, from an audience already. And as you answer the question, David, can you also tell him which one was bigger, Seismosaurus or Argentinosaurus?
So there's different ways to measure size, obviously. So if we normally, as biologists, we think of weight as being like the best measure of size. And so if we look at weight, Argentinosaurus reached about 80 tons in weight, which is huge. That's like bigger than 13 elephants, or like over sort of 700 Ms, sort of this 70 to 80 ton range. And Argentinosaurus is the biggest dinosaur we've got good evidence for is getting this big. We know there's several other titanosaurs as well, things like Patagotitan and Notocolossus and Alamosaurus could have reached similar sort of sizes. And we even have fragmentary remains of a few other sauropods that could have also reached these kinds of sizes. Now, as well as weight, you can also look to which was the longest. And if you have the longest dinosaurs, Argentinosaurus is a very long dinosaur at 35 meters long, but the other longest dinosaurs include Supersaurus and Diplodocus. And Seismosaurus is now thought to be a species of Diplodocus. What we used to call Seismosaurus, we now think called Diplodocus halorum, its own species of Diplodocus. And so it was one of the very longest dinosaurs. So again, about 35 meters, so slightly longer than a blue whale. So the biggest in terms of weight were Argentinosaurus and some other titanosaurs, but things like Diplodocus, so formerly Seismosaurus, and Supersaurus could get just as long or even slightly longer. So it depends which sort of size metric you're interested in.
Mm-hmm. I love that the names are all, you can tell that they're big just by their name, like Titan, Super, I don't know, Colossus. They're really...
So one of the most dramatic ones is Sauroposeidon. And because Poseidon, we think of as god of the seas, but he was also god of earthquakes. So it's like lizard Poseidon, because they thought, oh, when it walked, it would have like made earthquakes and so on. But
And that one would have been one of the tallest as well, right? Not in length.
Yeah. So the tallest
Either
dinosaurs
road.
include Sauroposeidon, but then also Xinjiang Titan, which you can see here, which had an extremely long neck. And these things could have reached sort of around 17 meters in height or more. So that's like way over 3 times taller than a giraffe, much taller than a giraffe. So these things really were just massive in all dimensions.
Now, David, we've got a question from Finley, from our audience. They're asking, how do you know how much they weigh?
So there's different techniques people to use to estimate how much they weighed. So for one thing is to make like a volume reconstruction. So take the skeleton and then work out, okay, how much flesh would have been on there, and then work out how much would be lungs, how much would be organs, what's the density of all of these things, and then top all these up, and you can then get a measure of the weight. So that's a very exact but quite time-consuming way to do it. Another way people do it is by looking at the dimensions of the limbs. So people have looked across all living animals and seen what the relationship between like the circumference of its weight-bearing limbs are to its weight. And from that, you generate an equation which you can use to calculate weight. And that's also applied to these giant sauropods. And then these two lines of evidence are cross-referenced with each other, and we use that to like get a weight estimate for them.
So a little bit of maths there, right? So the
Yeah,
maths for this.
quite a lot of maths, but I'm very lucky in that people who are more mathematical than me have figured all this out. But
No, David, we had a look at the biggest ones. There were some small ones, though, weren't there?
yeah, so a few sauropods got a lot smaller. So this is the skull of Europasaurus, which is a dinosaur from Germany, from the Jurassic of Germany. And you can see it compared to the skull of Giraffatitan, another like brachiosaur in the background. You can see it's much smaller. So Europasaurus was only about 6 meters long and sort of 700 kilograms plus in weight. So that still seems big to us, but it's much smaller than these other sauropods. And then also in the late Cretaceous, we see animals like Magyarosaurus and Plutatitan, which were titanosaurs that were only about 6 meters long and again, sort of about 750 kilos in weight. And what's interesting about all of these small sauropods is that they all lived on islands. So for much of the Mesozoic, large parts of Europe were an island archipelago because the sea levels were higher. And this is part of a phenomenon we see in biology where large animals will evolve to smaller sizes on islands because there's less space and less food, but then also there's fewer predators. So they don't need to be as big to protect themselves from attack. So it's then kind of interesting. We see like these small island sauropods as well as like the massive mainland ones.
That's amazing. Now, David, you mentioned there, well, maybe in the islands the predators would have been that terrible, but honestly, with the big dinosaurs, the 30-meter ones, I can't imagine anything attacking them and actually dreading to do it. Did they have any predators though?
So yeah, you're right in that size is one of the best defenses an animal can have, because like rough rule of thumb, like it's rough, but if there's a fight between two animals, generally the bigger one wins. And in particular, when an animal is sort of 10 times heavier than its predators, we generally think that it's pretty safe from attack. Because if you think about just trying to fight something that big, you can't just fight something that big. It'd be like trying to have a fist fight with a house. It just wouldn't work. And particularly something that big, something like an Argentinosaurus, something that big and strong and powerful, even a glancing kick or just blow from the body of the tail could easily be fatal to a much smaller theropod.
Amazing.
They'd just be on constant risk of being crushed underfoot, really. But sauropods have been vulnerable when they were younger and still growing. And also some sauropods were nowhere near that size. Many sauropods were much smaller and they would have been more vulnerable to attack. And if we look at places where sauropods occur, we often see alongside them the remains of large allosauroids. So these include things like Allosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus. And these things are quite narrow skulls bearing long blade-like teeth. And these teeth would have been inflicted like sort of big slashing wounds. They wouldn't be for like crunching down, they'd be for slashing. And so these things may have been able to take on quite large and dangerous prey, like juvenile sauropods, by coming in and doing like hit and run slashing attacks to gradually weaken them through blood loss until eventually they succumbed and they could feed on them. Now, some have suggested that these theropods might even have formed mobs or packs to help take on much larger sauropods, a bit like how with these days we see that wolves will team together to take on bison. But unfortunately, the evidence for that is really weak. So sometimes we do find the skeletons of predators like Allosaurus preserved together. Some people thought, oh, maybe this is remains of a pack. But if you look closely, those Allosaurus remains are also covered in Allosaurus tooth marks. So it seems that what we had here is there was like two Allosaurus feeding on a sauropod carcass. and then they started a fight over it, and one killed the other, and then started to eat the other one, and then so on. So whether there was actually any sort of level of cooperation, there's no real evidence for that. That's entirely speculative.
That's amazing, but that's a little bit of the detective work that paleontologists like yourself do. You look at the fossils, and then you have to deduce from that all those stories, what was going on there, how did they die, and also how did they look as well, right? David, we had a question from the audience. Ethan was asking, how do you tell what they look like from only very little bones? And how do you know so much about how they behave just by looking at the bones?
Yes, that's quite tough. So often what we depend upon is when we've got quite complete skeletons, like that Camarasaurus we saw earlier, they can act like a Rosetta Stone to help us understand related animals. So like we saw the giant Argentinosaurus earlier, we saw from the skeleton. I said we had quite a lot of it because it is quite a lot comparatively. We had parts of its spine and its hip and its legs. So it can be hard to work out what the rest of it looked like. But more recently, we found the skeleton of Patagotitan, which was a close relative of Argentinosaurus, and we've had very complete skeletal remains for it. So by looking at this close relative, it helps us to work out what Argentinosaurus would look like. It's like how you could figure out what a zebra looks like by comparing it with a horse. If you had an incomplete zebra skeleton, it's like, okay, I know this looks like a horse. So that helps us to work out even quite incomplete sauropods, like their overall dimensions of what they would have looked like. In terms then of like the soft tissues, we can use scars and other features on the bone to rebuild the muscles, because when your muscles touch the bone, they leave like these scars and surfaces. So you can use that to work out what muscles dinosaurs would have had. And we can also look at that by looking at dinosaurs' evolutionary relatives, like birds, to see what they would have had. And then we can think about what organs they would have needed and that kind of thing. So by piecing these bits of evidence together, we can start to build up quite a complete picture of even very incomplete dinosaur remains.
That's amazing. As I said before, sorry, David, but you guys are the absolute detectives, so better than Sherlock Holmes even. Now, I'm going to go back to the predators, because we think about, they were so big, and you mentioned again, you know, just the sheer size would have deter any predators from attacking them. But did they have any other ways of defending themselves, sauropods did?
Yeah, so as well as just overall size and strength, several sauropods also had like some weapons. So this is a skeleton of Shunosaurus. It's a Chinese sauropod, and it was quite small for a sauropod. It was only about 9 meters long, which would have put it more in the range of attackers. But the last few vertebrae in its tail were fused together to form like this ball-like club. And so what this would have helped to do, if it could swung that, would be like this, just like this weight on the end of the tail to help clout attacking theropods with around the face, or other parts of the body, I guess. And then so we think in general, sauropods would have swept their tail to help keep predators at bay. And so particularly people think about the things like Diplodocus, so like Dippy, they have these very long whip-like tail tips. They wouldn't have like cracked those like a bullwhip though, because the tip of it being so thin would be quite fragile, but certainly the heavier tail nearer the base could be used to sweep a carnivore off its feet and that kind of thing. But another weapon sauropods had was that most of them had an enlarged claw on the thumb. And this was particularly large in diplodocoids like Diplodocus. And this was probably used for various functions, but one of them might have been as a weapon when like lashing out with the forelimbs against attackers. So they could rear up on the hind legs and lash out, or they could even like rear up and then bring their forelegs crashing down on a theropod to crush it into wallpaper paste. So these sort of ways that have sort of helped to defend themselves. Now, in terms of some more flamboyant structures, relatively recently, a dinosaur called Pahadasaurus was discovered, which has these long curving spines over its neck vertebrae. And it's quite similar to another sauropod we have called a Margosaurus, which had these backwardly directed spines on its neck vertebrae. Now, these might look fearsome, but they're too thin and ineffectually placed to be weapons. These wouldn't be functional weapons or armor in any way, really. But what they might have done is helped these sauropods, which again were quite small for sauropod standards, look much bigger and scarier than they really were, both to their own rivals, but then also to predators. So they might have helped as like an intimidation tactic to help keep predators away. And the more practical armor is potentially found in some titanosaurs. So some titanosaurs preserve bony scutes called osteoderms. Now, in adults, these scutes are probably quite sparsely spread over the body surface, so they might not have served particularly well as armor for adults, but they might have formed a more tightly knit suit of armor for young titanosaurs. This might help protect them from attack. So sauropods did have various ways to defend themselves beyond just like brute size and strength.
That's amazing. Again, like huge diversity within the giant dinosaur with a long neck and a long tail, and I find it amazing. David, we've been getting loads of questions from our audience, and some of them
Mhm.
are the ones that I was planning to ask you, because the next question that I had ready was asking you about the neck, and in fact, we have Rianne. Actually wondering if this is a silly question, and I have to say, Rianne, it's not a silly question at all. Finding out why sauropods have developed such long necks, and if it's the same reason as giraffes did in later on.
So that's a very good question, Ryan, actually, because that's something which a lot of paleontologists have spent a lot of time trying to look into and work out. So as you say, like most sauropods had very long necks, is what they're most famous for. And the longest necks are seen in groups like the Mamenchisaurids. So the Mamenchisaurids were crazy, like the neck could be more than half the total length of their body. Some big Mamenchisaurids like Xinjiang Titan, that could be a neck 15 meters long. So that's over 7 times longer than a giraffe's neck. So it's just crazy. But we think they developed long necks for a similar way to help them with feeding, to help expand the total reach for their feeding. But that's not just vertically, so not just feeding high like a giraffe, but also all around. So you see here, that's kind of represented by the big sort of circles in front of them. That's like the region they could reach around with this neck. So in that way, think not so much like a giraffe, but like a goose or a swan, where they have very flexible necks that help them reach high, but also all around. And that enables geese and swans to like have really high intake rates to get loads and loads of food very quickly, which for sauropods they'd need to help fuel their massive bodies. And different sauropod species seem to have emphasized different parts of this vertical or horizontal movement. So things like Brachiosaurus had very tall necks and tall shoulders, and so they would have like browsed at very high heights, like at the canopy level of the trees. But things like Diplodocus had necks that are more flexible horizontally and less flexible vertically. So I think Diplodocus might have been like a giant vacuum cleaner and swept its neck across fern prairies to help pick off plants that way, just wandering around. But even then, Diplodocus could still reach up high because its neck was so long and it could tip up on its back legs. So, as you say, yeah, we think the main reason sauropods got such big, long necks was to help expand their feeding range, but that wasn't only in the vertical plane like in giraffes.
That's amazing. What about breathing then, David? Because such a long,
Oh, yeah.
that's it's I don't know. The air has to go through a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, so if you think the way we breathe, like with our lungs, like tidal breathing in and out, that's very inefficient. And if we had a big long neck like that, it'd be like trying to breathe through a straw, as you said. You wouldn't be able to like refresh the dead space in there, so you'd suffocate. But sauropods got around this by having a very efficient respiratory system. So if you look at the vertebrae of a sauropod, they have these big, deep, like recesses and like cavities in them. And we see the same sort of thing in living birds. And this shows that, like living birds, sauropods had air sacs, so extensions of the respiratory tract, which sort of invade the skeleton. And these air sacs act like bellows and drive this unidirectional flow of air through the lungs. And this gives modern birds very efficient breathing. That's how some birds are able to fly, very high altitudes. They can extract a lot of oxygen from the air. And the sauropods, this sort of help them not only get a lot of oxygen, but also this unidirectional flow eliminates the problem of dead space in the neck. So it enables them to have these really long necks and still be able to breathe. And that's a reason why mammals like the giraffes, they just can't develop the long necks like sauropods can, because they won't be able to breathe through it. And we might come to later, that has big ramifications for how big mammals can get.
There you go. Now going back to what they fed. So we had a question from Phoebe. She's saying that we have a wide variety of sauropods, and they want to know how varied the diets were, and what sort of things did they eat. And that hasn't got to do so much with the neck, but with the teeth. Is that right, David?
Yeah, so if we look at sauropod teeth, we can see that they all ate plants. But there was a lot of variance with regards to what they ate within those plants. So the weirdest sauropod in this regard is Nigersaurus. So it's a relatively small ribachosaurid sauropod from Niger. And you can see its skull. Its skull's just bizarre. It's really lightweight. It's very delicately constructed. But the front of it is extremely wide. It's got this very wide, sort of squared off, almost duck-like mouth. And then in that mouth, it has 128 teeth packed together. and the teeth in both jaws are packed together to form like these blades, which are used to like clip through plants. So think it acts like a guillotine to hoover up sort of small, soft plants like horsetails and ferns from the ground level. But some other sauropods are very different. So things like Camarasaurus had these sort of wide, sort of spoon or spatula-shaped teeth, and these came together in an interlocking, like clipping bite, and this would have helped them to bite through leaves, and they had very powerful jaw muscles to help them like crunch even through small branches and get off all of this foliage to swallow. It's important to remember that sauropod teeth show us none of them really chewed their food. They just sort of gulped it down, like swallowed it whole very quickly, which is terrible manners, but would help them get a lot of food down their neck when they needed to. And then some others like Diplodocus had like very sort of slender pencil-like teeth. And these would have been used in some things like snip, like a clipping bite to snip off leaves. Then Diplodocus in particular is unusual, and its teeth stick out a bit like a rake. And so we think it used them to grip food, and then it pulled it back with the neck to help detach the food and then to swallow it. So they had all different ways of feeding, and these different ways of feeding meant that they were sort of exploiting different plants. So like Nigersaurus was feeding on like low-growing ferns and horsetails, and Diplodocus, we think, mostly fed upon low-growing ferns, but also would have fed upon some treetop leaves by rearing up. And then Camarasaurus would have been biting through quite heavy browse, like thick leaves and sort of thin tree branches and that sort of thing. So sauropods really between them would have eaten all different kinds of foods, and we see that in different features of the skulls and the teeth and the muscles. That being said, though, they're big animals. They all would have had broad diets and in all sorts of plants that they could. But a particularly funky part of the sauropod feeding is how they replace their teeth. So dinosaurs, they weren't like you or I, where we only have our milk teeth and then our adult teeth, and then that's it. They're like other reptiles and things like sharks, and their teeth grew constantly. So you can see here's like a couple of skulls of Camarasaurus and Diplodocus, and they've been put in transparent, so you can see the teeth growing in the mouth to replace the old teeth as they fall out. And sauropods in general replace their teeth quite often because their big diets meant they had a lot of wear. But particularly in diplodocoids like Diplodocus and then also Nigersaurus, they replace their teeth very quickly. So Nigersaurus in particular replaced its teeth at a rate of 1 tooth per fortnight, which is very high.
Wow.
And if you think of Nigersaurus, each of its 128 teeth, up to 7 teeth could be growing for each of those in the head to come down and replace it. So it had over 500 teeth in its head at any one time. And the reason we think that things like Diplodocus and Nigersaurus replaced their teeth so quickly is because they were feeding at low levels where they'd ingest a lot of grit accidentally. And also things like horsetails have little shards of silica, so glass in their tissue. So they're soft, they wear their teeth down very quickly. So these things would have to keep replacing their teeth to keep rates with this really high levels of abrasion.
That's amazing. We actually had a really interesting question from the audience. Simon was asking, is it true they ate rocks to help digestion then?
So that's interesting. So a thing that's been positive for quite a lot of dinosaurs is that they swallowed stones to grind plants up in a gizzard. And certainly we know that many theropods, things like the ostrich mimic one of the mimosaurs, used stones for a gastric meal in the same way as modern birds. And we used to think the same thing with sauropods, that you often find polished stones with sauropod skeletons. However, more recently, some people have looked in great detail at gastroliths in living birds like ostriches and noticed first they don't get this polished texture, they get quite an abraded texture, but also that they're usually present as quite a significant amount, between 1 to 10% of the animal's body weight. And in sauropods, the stones are only ever present in like tiny fractions of the animal's total body weight. So we think the sauropods probably, at least for the most part, didn't actually use gastroliths, but instead these were stones they'd swallowed by accident or had post-mortem become associated with the carcasses. So we think instead sauropods just swallowed things whole, and rather than grinding it down, they just digested it for very long periods of time in really massive digestive tracts to get all the goodness out of it. And that's an advantage for maybe part of the reason they grew so big in the first place, is so they could have this big digestive tract to spend a lot of time thoroughly processing their food.
That's amazing. Now we have a very interesting question as well coming from the audience, David. It has to do, I suppose, it has to do with the necks as well. But Blake is asking, do we know what noises they make?
So unfortunately, we don't really have much of an idea of the noises sauropods made, because we don't really know any structure of what any kind of voice box they might have had, what that may have been like. Because like the oldest fossilized voice box from any dinosaur is from a Cretaceous bird, We don't have anything from other things, so we don't really know what noises they may have made. And because they were so big, the noises they made have been very deep. So, like modern elephants, presumably they would have communicated a lot via ultrasound. So you might have felt their noises more than you would have heard them a lot of the time. But unfortunately, we still don't really know.
That's amazing. Feeling the noise rather than hearing them coming in, you just feel them.
Yeah, just feel it somewhere in your gut. Yeah.
Now, David, a lot of questions are coming from our audience as well. Have to do with the next bit I wanted to talk about, and is how they grew so big,
Yeah.
little. So one of the questions that our audience were asking is, how big were they when they were born? How big their eggs were?
Yeah. So sauropods all laid eggs, and the biggest sauropod eggs are about 30 centimeters across. They're similar in size to a football. And that sounds quite big until you think how big the adult was, and you realize that the eggs are actually very small compared to the adult. And that's because they couldn't lay like one big egg, because at that sort of size, the eggshell would be so thick to stop it from collapsing under its own weight that the baby wouldn't actually be able to escape. So instead, sauropods laid larger numbers of small eggs. But that meant when the baby hatched, it was very small. So even the biggest ones would probably be like less than half a meter long when they hatched, meaning they had a lot of growing to do. Now, if you want to look at how a dinosaur grew, the best way is if someone's kind enough to let you cut through a dinosaur bone, you can look at its internal structure. And sometimes you'll see growth rings, like the rings of a tree. And so counting those, you can work out how old the dinosaur was. And sometimes they don't leave growth rings because they're growing too fast, but you can still look at the texture to work out how quickly they grew. By comparing these across lots of individuals of different sizes, and within the same individual, we can get an idea of how quickly a dinosaur would have grown through its life. And we can see from this that baby sauropods grew very quickly. So until their teens, they grew like at very, very rapid rates, like potentially as much as like 500 kilos a year or more, through up until their teens. Then at their teens is when they became, was when they hit breeding age. And after that, their growth slowed and they reached maximum body size in their late 20s to their 30s. So they had a lot of growing to do, but they did it quite quickly. And this is interesting applications for their metabolism. Because if we think of that baby sauropods growing very, very quickly, that implies they had a high metabolism like that of living warm-blooded birds and mammals, rather than a cold-blooded metabolism like living reptiles, because like a reptile would just take too long to ever grow that fast. So we think that at least when they were young, they would have been what we would think of as warm-blooded and growing very quickly. But when they're an adult, that would cause problems with them, because when you're big, that would give them even bigger appetites. And also, when you're big, you hold heat very well. Regardless of whether you're warm-blooded or cold-blooded, you retain heat just because you're more thermally efficient at bigger sizes. And in fact, warm-blooded animal that size be at severe risk of overheating. So we think the metabolism of these things may have declined somewhat as they got older from their like early, really high growth rates. And this helps in a way, like dinosaurs have really helped us to understand living animals better, which sounds almost paradoxical, but there's been so much interest in what the metabolism of dinosaurs was like. That's really helped us realize that what we used to think of as warm-blooded and cold-blooded are really end members in a whole different spectrum of strategies, even that we see today. And so it really has changed how we think about living animals too.
That's incredible. Again, more detective work, and then using the past to know more about the future. That's really, really important. David, we had another question regarding also how the growth. They were asking, Mariette was asking, how long did they live for then? Because you've roughly said until 30 they kept growing, but do we know then living then?
To work out how old something was, again, if you're fortunate enough to have the growth rings, you can count those up. And so for those, for example, we know that one individual of the sauropod Yanentia reached about 38 years old. It sort of died about 38. The problem is we don't know how long they could live, partially because animals very rarely die of old age in the wild. So we don't know what actually killed this thing. It could have been disease or predation or anything. And then also, when sauropods and other animals get older, they tend to start to remodel their bones, so you lose these growth rings, so you can't count. So we know that some of them would have lived at least until like they were 40, and it seems likely that some of them probably would have lived a lot longer, but it's difficult to say for sure.
That's amazing. Now, we had a couple of questions very, very early in the show, even before we started. Eve, who is 3, asked, what did they have Such small brains.
Yeah, so
Damn,
people
we tend to think them as slow.
people like to make a lot of light about how sauropods have these very tiny heads, and so even more than other dinosaurs, you think, okay, they must have these tiny brains. You know, they must be idiots. But actually, we can get an idea of the structure of the brain by looking at the internal surface of the brain case, and this gives us an idea of how big the brain was and how it was structured. And if we do this and actually compare it to other reptiles, because the sauropods didn't have particularly small pea brains, their brains were actually within the range that we would expect from living reptiles. And living reptiles are capable of great behavioral complexity and various acts of smarts. So, you know, sauropods wouldn't have been geniuses or anything, but they still would have had all the smarts they needed to get about their day-to-day lives.
That's amazing. So no so dumb, probably.
Yeah, like, of course,
That's a bit
anything that
unfair.
big is going to be quite slow reaction times, but it's never really fair. It's never really fair to call an animal like dumb, really, because every animal is just as smart as it needs to be to live its day-to-day life.
That's amazing. Now, David, we had a lot of questions from the audience, and I'd like to ask you a few because they're really, really interesting. There are a few questions related to the skin and what do you know about it? First of all, do we have fossilized skin? And then the two big questions: do we know the colors they wear, and did they have any feathers?
So we do have some sauropod fossil skin, but it's quite rare. So we have some skin impressions that show sort of like polygonal, like scales arranged in like this mosaic. And we also, interestingly, have some impressions of Diplodocus skin showing it had like these spines down the back. So you probably saw in the picture Diplodocus earlier, have like these little like spikes down the back that have been keratinous just for display, really. So what we have from sauropods suggests already that they were scaly. Now, unfortunately, we don't know what colors they were. So I know some people are probably aware that in some of the remarkably preserved dinosaurs from China in particular, the skin and the feathers in particular are preserved in such fine detail that people have been able to look at pigment cells and work out some of the colors that some dinosaurs would have been. But we don't have any remains like that for sauropods. So we don't really know what color any sauropods would be. And with regards to feathers, we don't have any evidence of feathers in sauropods either, unfortunately. So for the adults, it seems very unlikely because, as we've already discussed, they'd be having trouble shedding heat, not keeping it. So in the same way that elephants don't have hair, we wouldn't expect sauropods to have feathers. For youngsters, we just don't know. We don't have any evidence of the skin of thing for younger sauropods. And working out exactly how widely feathers are distributed within dinosaurs is like a really intensive area of research at the moment. So maybe one day we'll know, but for the moment, as far as we know, all sauropods were scaly.
Again, loads of things to still find out about sauropods, which is always really exciting when it comes to science. How much we still need to know. Now, one big question then, David, is I think we've touched a few things throughout the show, but it is why are they so big? So why are they so huge? And why no other land animal, land mammal had gotten to that side? We've got giraffes, we've got elephants, but the whales, which are the ones that approach them, they might be even bigger. They live in the sea. So yeah, again, why are they so big? And why hasn't that happened?
So that is a good question. So, like, large size carries many advantages for animals. You're safe from attack, as we've said. You can travel long distances more efficiently. You're protected against short-term like changes in food and water availability. So there's lots of reasons to get big. So the real question is, why can't other animals do what sauropods can? It seems that sauropods just had this unique combination of characteristics that allowed them alone to get so big. So the big thing between dinosaurs in general and mammals is, of course, that dinosaurs laid eggs, and sauropods laid large numbers of eggs, but they didn't invest very much in each. And that's very different if you think of a mammal, where a mammal the size of a sauropod would have to spend a very long time gestating a calf. That would have a big burden on the mother, but then also it means that their birth rates would be very low. So you think of elephants. Elephants have very long times, spend very long times pregnant to produce quite large calves, and have to spend a long time looking after that. And that means that elephant birth rates are very low. And this is important over evolutionary time because big animals can only ever have quite small populations because there's only room for a few. And that means their populations could be vulnerable to disasters like droughts or famines or that kind of thing. So this means that sauropods, by producing a large number of eggs, even quite a small population would be able to rapidly recolonize after a disaster in a similar sort of way that a mammal couldn't. Also, if we think about other features of the sauropods, we think of their long necks, which help them get enough food they needed to get so big. So mammals weren't able to get such long necks because of their lungs, as we discussed earlier. And even other plant-eating dinosaurs, things like the duck-billed dinosaurs, we don't know what their lungs would have been like necessarily, but they also had like these big batteries of chewing teeth because they chewed their food very finely. And these big, heavy teeth and big skulls would stop them getting long necks. So it seems kind of somewhat paradoxical, but the fact that sauropods didn't chew probably helped them get so big because it allowed them just to gulp lots of food straight down. And instead, because they were so big, they could ferment the food for a really long time in big guts to get the energy from it. So they kind of had this sort of unique strategy, which is sort of paradoxical, but they fixed it through size. They had really high intake rates of what they ate, but because they were big, they were also able to stew it for a long time rather than it passing straight through. So I think that's quite important. So really, it's this combination of characteristics of like their lungs, their long necks, potentially changes in metabolism as they grew, and then certainly the fact that they laid eggs and like lots of small eggs that helped them get so big. And then even like the babies had various features of skulls and teeth that suggest they ate different foods and potentially even lived in different areas for the adults. So that stopped them competing with each other. But then also the differences in sauropods help explain the differences in the whole Mesozoic ecosystem. So you think like today on the Serengeti, you've got like a small number of large predators like lions and so on. But in dinosaur times, you have like loads of big predators, like you've got Allosaurus and Torvosaurus and Ceratosaurus all living alongside each other. It's like, well, how do you get enough meat to feed all these things? Do you think like living mammals like elephants, they look after their babies. And so living like big herbivores hoard biomass to themselves and they guard it like very jealously. Whereas sauropods, they produced large numbers of babies, but probably performed less parental care. So that meant they were pumping loads more meat and biomass into the ecosystem, so you could get all these like large theropods that fed on these like young sauropods. So it really helps to show us how like the world just worked completely differently back then.
That's amazing, and that's loads of clues that give us that information, David. But are we still missing some other clues? Do we still need to find out more things about this animal?
So there's lots of things we still don't know about sauropods, some of which touched on earlier, but particularly things like there's certain parts of the sauropod evolutionary tree that we still don't have a very firm understanding on, and that's important to get at all of these aspects of their lives and how they would have appeared and continued. Particular things like the Middle Jurassic, we've got very few dinosaur fossils in general, so we really want to know how things were diversifying back then. That's very interesting. Many of the titanosaurs, in particular, from sauropod skeletons are very incomplete. And that's interesting because titanosaurs represent about half of all sauropod diversity, and some of them were really weird. So it'd be really interesting to see about what some of them might have been like that we don't currently know of. And what I'm particularly interested in some of my work is looking at the moment is also the early evolution of them. We went from the prosauropods to the sauropods and the forces that led to like this trend of gigantism that we then see through the group. So yeah, there really is this, there's still loads of things that we don't know about them. There's still lots more research to be done.
So if any of our youngest audience, or even the oldest audience, want to become a paleontologist, there's still a lot of work to do, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. There's lifetimes of work left to do.
We had a couple of questions about that, and I didn't want to finish the show before without asking them. David, do you have any quick advice in a couple of words to budding paleontologists who want to become experts like you on dinosaurs?
So the key things are to stay in school and do science. So like if you want to be a paleontologist, make sure you are good at the sciences and maths, potentially, unfortunately, because what you'll need as a paleontologist is you need a sound understanding of biology and geology, and appreciation also for chemistry, physics, and maths. If you're good at science and maths in school and stick at those, then when you go to university, you can apply to do either a paleontology course or a biology course, a geology course, and they'll have parts of paleontology in it. And from then you could go on to do a PhD in paleontology and be a full-fledged one. So yeah, that's the main thing you need to do.
There you go. Now that was a bit of a serious question, David, but let's we get into the end of the show, but we had a really fun question from our audience. Now, being so big, Could sauropods get up if they fell over?
So yeah, that's an interesting question. Sauropods walked in an unusual way compared to what we think of as many living animals. So like the back legs provided most of the power, and the forelimbs were more like props, like in some ways like props to help them walk. So obviously they walked on all fours. They didn't walk like we think of as living animals. And so and some sauropods also seem to have been like relatively agile is not the right word, but like so many sauropods seem to have a well-developed rearing up capacity to rear up onto their back legs. And so those, it seems like they would be fine to, to be able to get up if they've actually flexibility, if they get over and fell over, like some of them have like quite flexible spines. But for some of the largest sauropods, like the very biggest ones, like obviously they'd be able to lay down flat, but it does seem that if you fall at that sort of size, that could easily be fatal. So some of the larger sauropods may have struggled with it. It's not really clear. But it's notable that many of the biggest sauropods are titanosaurs, and titanosaurs had what we call a wide gauge stance. So that is, the limbs were spread out a little bit, and that would have helped stabilize the body to make it harder for them to tip over. So these sort of things are probably crucial to stop them having a fall, because as you say, if you slip over and are that big, you could easily severely injure yourself. And if you severely injure yourself, like you fracture your leg or something, then that's it, you're finished. So yeah, they'd have to be they're very stable, but I guess still quite a careful life.
Again, David, what really, really strikes me from all that you've talked about is the detectiving work that you're doing there. So you take the skeleton and you deduce all this information, even whether they would easily fall over and how they would start up. That's amazing.
Yeah, so how exactly they moved is a real sort of area of uncertainty that a lot of people are looking at. So yeah, that's another area of research that people out there might want to think about, they could do in the future.
There you go. Now we've reached the end of the show, David. It's been fantastic. Before we say goodbye to you, there's something that you've touched during the show that I think is really important. I'd like you to tell us more about. Why is paleontology so important? Why is it important to get about animals, living organisms that were alive long time ago, they're not alive anymore?
So sometimes people could think of paleontology as quite esoteric, because I think, oh, these are things that lived millions of years ago, But it's really important to show us the limits that life can attain. Because if you compare like fossil animals to living animals, like before we found the giant mammals and dinosaurs and things in the fossil record, people thought that, life on land couldn't get bigger than an elephant. And they had good reasons for believing that. But looking at the fossil record shows us that understanding was completely wrong. And so by looking at these like things that live at the very limits of biology, we can really understand the fundamentals of biology in much more detail. And importantly, that sort of highlights that people think of like the living biosphere as representative, but it's only a single time slice in the long history of life on Earth. And not only is it only a single time slice, it's also a very biased time slice, because the actions of humans since prehistory have killed off a lot of the large or very interesting or unusual animals on Earth. So we can't get a comprehensive understanding of how biology and plants and animals work from living things alone. We need the fossil record to show us some of the different amazing things life has done that just don't exist today.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, David. I hope that I really, really hope that people leave with that feeling and wanting to know more about the past. And we'll have some paleontologists that are watching now and will get to become paleontologists in the future. Now, we've run out of time, but thank you so much, David, for joining us today and tell us so much about sauropods. I'm sure that now they are the favorite dinosaur of many people watching.
I hope so. Yeah,
thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Now, thank you so much as well to you all for watching today, for sending your wonderful questions. They were excellent. And I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of them. We had so many. But if you enjoyed the show today, we've got so much more coming up. Now, Nature Live happens on Tuesdays at 12 and on Fridays at 10:30, like today. And there'll be more shows coming up next week. Now, we're going to be talking about something very different. Next Tuesday, we'll be talking about the Andean bear, South American bear. So if you're interested on that, come and join us for that show. Apart from that, we'll be really, really grateful if you tell us what you think in our survey that we'll post in different channels and in social media. So click on it and tell us what you thought of the show. If you enjoyed it, if you didn't enjoy it so much, we'll like to hear that too. But apart from that, that's all from us today. We'll see you next week, and have a lovely Friday and a lovely weekend. Bye.